He is the current president of the Society for Ecological Medicine. He, for 20 years, was the editor of the Journal of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine. He's an authority on the gut, on parasites, has written numerous books, and one of his latest is The Vitamin Cure for Digestive Illness. Please welcome Dr. Damien Downing. Hi, Damien.
Hello there. Hi.
It's so great to see you. So you've been a real leader, a real trailblazer in this whole area of ecological medicine, and you've seen your fair share of gut issues. Now, I know you have some slides prepared for us that are a real amazing revelation about the role of vitamin D and much more. So let's make sure that I will turn you into a co-host.
Okay, so how does that look to you?
That looks great. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll kind of start from this point, really. I was thinking about it not so long ago. I mean, when I started in this, it was just when people were starting to say, well, do you know people can get these things called food allergies? And so, no, not really. It's all in their minds, you know. And then chemical sensitivities. And so we treated things like an allergy a lot those days. And over the last few years, maybe the last decade, has that happened less and less because we're starting to see it all as a much wider picture. And there's a whole bunch of new diagnostic terms that come in, like mast cell activation syndrome, chronic inflammatory response, and so forth, you know. But it does seem to remain true that what Hippocrates said how many thousand years ago, I don't really know, is still the case. Everything starts with the gut. Mm-hmm. And this excellent paper from Aaron Lerner, who's a respected researcher in Israel, kind of sums it up, really. If you read that sentence that I've pulled up there, 2 sentences, if you list those things: glucose, salt, emulsifiers, solvents, gluten, transglutaminase, and nanoparticles all increase intestinal permeability, leakiness of the gut, right? And who of anybody can put their hand up and say, I'm never exposed to any of these. I have a completely pure life. I mean, however good you are at doing it yourself, the rest of the world's doing it for you. You know? And actually these days, you should add to that glyphosate, because glyphosate is everywhere. All the biomass, the plants that are grown for biofuel are Roundup ready and therefore glyphosate treated. So we're breathing in the darn stuff the whole time. So all of these factors are giving us a leaky gut. So if any of us don't have a leaky gut, we're actually doing pretty well. And
yes,
this obviously,
glyphosate is, you're talking about pesticides. The pesticides that are being sprayed on foods all over the place, and also people are using in their backyards and back gardens.
I know they are, yeah. And you know, the council uses them outside our door on the stuff going out of the pavement.
Amazing.
And so, despite my letters too, however. And also glyphosate is in the biofuel, so it's coming out of the back end of the bus that goes past, and so forth. So things aren't at the moment really getting better in that regard. So we are all therefore vulnerable to this damage to our gut. And what happens when your gut becomes too permeable is that some quite large molecules can go through into the bloodstream, and everything that comes from the gut into the bloodstream is taken straight to the liver in the portal vein. So if you've got an extra leaky gut, there can be a lot of stuff going through that route into the liver. There's an increased toxic burden on the liver, which furiously is trying to detox this stuff and pump it out into the bile, the gallbladder, down the bile duct into the gut again. So really, within 20 minutes probably of eating this sort of stuff, you're getting a double hit from it as it comes back into the gut. And so you perpetuate the inflammation and the problems. And this is one of the vicious cycles that you get with the gut. Dr. Leo Galland in New York has written brilliantly on this. And this is the most obvious one, the toxic vicious cycle. There's also an allergic one that when you irritate the immune system by different macromolecules going through into the bloodstream and accessing the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, the immune system in the gut, you set off inflammatory reactions. And that makes the gut more leaky, it makes the cells lining of the gut more vulnerable to the damage, and so more stuff goes through and the thing perpetuates itself. One interesting instance of this is the whole question of gluten reactions or wheat. And I know years ago, doctors used to think that, oh, either you've got celiac and it's pretty rare, one in a few thousand or whatever, or, you know, you're just being neurotic. But it's not like that, because we now realize that as well as full-blown celiac syndrome, there are a lot of lesser forms of it, non-celiac gluten enteropathy, as it's called, where you get inflammation in the gut and subsequently elsewhere, of course. And one of the ways that can happen is this, because if it can get to them, there's a protein on the surface of wheat that will attack the cells lining the gut. Normally, it can't get to them, so it can't do it because there's a layer of mucus, and we have to come back to mucus later when we're talking about phosphatidylcholine and so forth. So if the mucus layer is destroyed or just broken up, and the wheat can get to the cells underlying it, then you set off the process of inflammation. And normally it can't, but there's a protein on the surface of a bunch of viruses, including common cold and things like that, called neuraminidase, which breaks down the mucus molecules. And so that allows the wheat and the wheat lectin, or the wheat agglutinin as it's called, to get to the cells lining the gut and cause them to be inflamed. And when that happens, inflammation increases the turnover of cells. You know, the cells get damaged and sloughed off. You know, I mean, we're already saying that the gut is normally in a state of physiological inflammation. You know, it's got the highest turnover rate of cells of anywhere in the body. So you up it a bit like that, and you're constantly producing young cells there. The young cells have a lot of the glycans that these lectins react to, so they're more susceptible to the lectin, to the inflammation caused by the wheat. So the thing just keeps itself going on and on and on. And that's a vicious cycle that you see in irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's, so on and so forth. And of course, inflammatory bowel disease in general, potentially. And so that means that there can easily be circumstances. I mean, other things can mess up with the mucus. You know, excessive alcohol, too many shots of good whiskey would strip the lining off your gut easily enough. And for that matter, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like aspirin and so forth, they do it. So it doesn't take much to expose the epithelial cells there. And if that happens, it may well be appropriate to try cutting out wheat and gluten and so forth for a period of time. And so I'd never criticize anybody for doing that, you know. And you can be constantly surprised in the people that it does seem to help. But it doesn't have to be a life sentence, you know, because it doesn't mean that you've got celiac disease or whatever. We can investigate that with laboratory tests, but it's usually not necessary. You know, 9 people out of 10 who have a wheat reaction problem in the gut, it's temporary and it can be easily fixed. And one of the things you have to do is to cut out wheat to do it. One of the important things we've come to realize for this whole thing is vitamin D, because vitamin D affects the integrity of cells. The way the guys in San Diego, the Garlands and so forth, who've done a lot of the research on vitamin D, particularly in the context of cancer, they say that what happens when a cell goes cancer is it's going rogue, it's isolated from the whole community of cells. Because if you look at the left slide here, this is it's a slice through the gut lining, and you see there's a cell on the left, a cell on the right, and line going down the middle is the junction between the cells. Now, that junction does 2 things, to put it simply. Number one, it stops stuff coming from the top of there, up where it says A, right through bypassing the actual cell and getting into the system in between the cells. And number 2, it enables communication from the cell on the left to the cell on the right and vice versa. Because in all these points, the TJ is tight junction, the AJ is the adherence junction, DS is desmosome. Each of these points, there are fibers and channels and so forth going across. So whenever a cell tries to go rogue and cancerous or whatever, in normal circumstances, it's stopped by all the other cells in the community that are in contact with it, saying, hey, what are you doing? Stop that. And if necessary, they may well cause it to apoptose, to program cell suicide. But what happens when you're vitamin D deficient is that you don't make those junctions as effectively. And the cell on the right, the 2 cells on the right, you can see the layer of tissue on the right, you can see what happens when you're vitamin D deficient. Now, to be honest, this is exaggerated. This is a laboratory experiment, and so it's only a model for what happens in real life. But I mean, who's going to give a sample of their bowel to do this sort of experiment on? You see what happens. That tight junction, the TJ, is completely destroyed, way apart. The adherence junction is better, but it's still not perfect. And the DS, the desmosomes, they're pretty bad too. So 2 things are happening here. Number one, stuff is getting through from top right through to bottom, bypassing the cells. And number 2, the communication between the cells is destroyed. And so this is a fundamental purpose for vitamin D. We took the model of chronic heart failure because there's quite some good evidence on this one. But really, it applies to pretty much any inflammatory disorder, chronic inflammatory disorder. And it's a very powerful illustration of the theory, if you like, that problems start in the gut. And so they have shown that in chronic heart failure, it isn't just a disease of the heart. It's a multi-system, multi-organ disorder. And one of the things that you find is there's edema of the bowel wall. It's actually swollen. You can do fine ultrasound to show this. You actually see that the bowel wall is thickened, swollen. And as a result of that, if it's swollen like that, it's increased permeability, it's leaky. I mean, if you burn, let's say, the back of your hand in the oven or something, it gets red and enlarged and swollen. And of course, if you put something on it that's mildly irritant, by God, you feel it. You know, even soap and things like that can be irritating. And same thing happens in the gut. If a tissue is swollen, then it's leaky. It's overpermeable. And the other thing that happens is that you get biofilm in the mucosa of the gut. Now, biofilm is where organisms live in order to become chronic. And there may be exceptions to this, but it's probably true that without biofilm, organisms can't become chronic because they're exposed to our immune system, if you've got a functioning immune system, obviously. So they're exposed to the immune system, therefore they get swept up and taken care of. The most obvious form of biofilm is the stuff you get on your teeth if you don't clean them for a day or two, whatever. And you can feel it, right? There's a texture. And note that you can't just rinse it off. It's quite strong stuff. You have to brush it off. Okay, so it's fairly strong stuff. And it's a sticky, slimy sort of substance that protects the organisms from our immune system. And it particularly actually happens on implants and things like that. So I'm talking about when people have central lines in, but also sometimes when they have, if you have silicone implants of any sort, and if biofilm forms on our tissue, then it's not so bad because our IgA, our external immunoglobulin, our antibodies, are included in the sticky stuff and therefore they deal with it. If the biofilm forms on an inert substance from outside, there's no IgA there, so the whole thing is that much worse. And so what we're looking at here, the guy on the right has a chronic heart failure problem, and the color that you can see there is all fluorescent microorganisms growing in the little pits, the crypts in the mucosa. And so they're making the gut inflamed and therefore leaky, and all their toxic substances, like the obvious one is lipopolysaccharide, that's going into the bloodstream, setting off immune and biochemical responses to try and deal with it. But of course, because there's biofilm there, they're ineffective. So the problem becomes chronic and just keeps going on. So one of the most important protections against this is the mucus lining of the gut. And the mucus is a similar way to the biofilm. It's a sort of sticky stuff, as you know. I mean, you can feel it inside your mouth. And part of it, an important part, is phosphatidylcholine. Phosphatidylcholine is the prime phospholipid. So a phospholipid is a lipid, that's a fat or an oil, with a phosphate bit on the end. And the fat and oil or oil is obviously fat soluble, it's not water soluble. And the phosphate bit is water soluble and not fat soluble. This is why all our cells the outer walls of it are made up of what's called a phospholipid bilayer. So there's the phospholipid molecules are quite long and straightish, and so they line up like a forest. And at the outside of the cell, you get the phosphate bit, which is in contact with the watery substance in our serum and so forth. Inside that, you get the fat molecules, the lipid molecules, and then there's a mirror image of it the other side. So there's another set of lipid molecules and another set of phosphate inside the cell. So that's the bilayer. And a lot of things happen in the bilayer, but they're only really enabled by this kind of a structure. But when you think about it, this stuff is kind of it's the secret of life. Life is basically the difference between what happens outside a cell and what happens inside a cell. And that just can't happen without phospholipids in general, and phosphatidylcholine in particular. In the gut, it's very interesting because the phosphatidylcholine is actually secreted into the gut in the last bit of the small intestine. That's the sort of funny little pink thing in the center there, right? And the bile that is pumped out by the liver, or should be, stimulates its secretion. And then it moves down by the peristalsis motion that happens in the gut to line the whole of the colon, the large bowel, which is the thing going around the outside. And so what it does there, it sits in the outermost layer, if you like, of the mucus, and it protects us from all the chemicals in the mucus, in the lining of the gut. Because normally there are quite a few things in the stuff that we eat that you really don't want to absorb. And in healthy circumstances, we don't absorb them. And that's because digestion is an active process. There are molecules there designed to pick up and transport all the amino acids, the lipids, and so on and so forth, the minerals and so forth that we need, right? And if we don't need it, then we don't transport it. And that's what, one of the fundamental purposes of vitamin D. It stimulates that process and means that there are more molecules there trying to capture calcium and bring them in and to recycle it. And a lot of stuff gets recycled goes out in the liver and gets reabsorbed from the intestine that way. And it's an active process. So the stuff that you don't want just stays in the gut and comes out the other end. And when you have a leaky gut, that's a problem. Because the stuff can get straight through the junctions that we saw there and be in the system, in the bloodstream in minutes. So the PC is critical there for the integrity of the gut and the normal functioning of the gut. And there's a form of PC that's in development. It's not on release yet, but it's an enteric coated one that the tablet doesn't break up until you reach further down the gut, like this. And so that is available to line the gut, whereas ordinary PC is less efficient at that, but you can still do it. Take large quantities of it, or lipids in general, and you can improve things. So I have seen people's gut function improved simply by taking lipids. But that gets a bit more complicated because of the, well, of the way our digestion works. A lot of people will have noticed that if you're going to get a general problem with food, it usually happens with fats first, you know. So there's a lot of people who say, oh, fats just don't agree with me. And you don't often have many people say, oh, proteins don't agree with me, whatever. The reason for that is this. By the time the food leaves the stomach and goes into the duodenum, the digestion of protein and carbohydrate is pretty much done. So it's only for the lipids, the fats and oils, that you need all the stuff that happens next. So that's the secretions from the pancreas and the bile coming from the liver and gallbladder and so forth. And remember that in this case, the bile stimulates the secretion of phosphatidylcholine further down the gut as well. So if your gut starts to subfunction, typically you notice it with the fats first because you need all this extra stuff. And so time and again, we found that general gut dysfunction, you can track it to the liver. And if you can stimulate the activity of the liver and gallbladder and so forth, then you can improve the whole gut function. By doing that, you'll be improving the absorption of nutrients, the removal of toxins, and general gut health and all health, in fact. Butyrate in general, there's a whole family of different molecules, as you can see here. There's more besides, but it's a 4-carbon atom long fat molecule. It's what's known as a short chain fatty acid. And butyrate is basically the antithesis of sugar. You get sugar, glucose, whatever, in your system. It stimulates inflammation, it feeds the organisms, it inhibits the immune system, it feeds cancers, and so on. And butyrate, which is one of the main ketones or ketone bodies, it's the largest one in numbers probably, does all the exact opposite things. It inhibits inflammation, it is antiviral, antibacterial, antifungal, and anti-cancer too. There are studies going on as we speak. And so this is why people are now talking about the ketogenic diet. Because ketogenic diet is low carb and high fat. And so that means that instead of absorbing lots of glucose, which rattles around your system, you're absorbing a lot of the molecules to make ketones instead. And if you do that well enough, then you can damp down inflammation and damp down the infections and so forth. Even the tricky ones like Helicobacter, the only bug that can live in the acidity of the stomach, that one is affected by butyrate as well. So you can do this with a ketogenic diet, but you can also take the stuff and cheat somewhat and get some very good effects. And it helps with detox and helps with everything in general. So I think I should probably leave it there and stop the slides. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, I've got loads of questions. So this was really fascinating and I think revolutionary, some of that information. As you say, when we first started, I know when I first started talking with people like you in the 1980s and 90s about allergies and leaky gut, there were many different ideas about so-called allergies than there are now. And it seems to start and end with a leaky gut, and the problems of inflammatory bowel disease start and end with a leaky gut. First question I had was, okay, somebody comes to you and they have a lot of issues. What are the first things that you would do in terms of tests? So they've got a lot of gut issues. And maybe they do have serious gut problems, but they're just complaining of things just not working properly. What are your favorite tests to offer them first?
Right. Well, you can do one of the tests for the gut permeability tests. But these days, to be honest, I'm come to think, for my purposes anyway, you should just assume, because of that first slide that I showed you, all these factors are working on us all the time. You should, if there's a problem in the gut, you've almost certainly got a leaky gut. And so, I mean, if you need persuading, or indeed if your doctors need persuading, then sure, do a leaky gut test, and that can tell you what can happen.
Yes, and I mean, in the UK, BioLab do a gut permeability test. So assuming that that is one of the main issues, even if somebody has inflammatory bowel disease. So what are the sorts of things that you would use to heal it?
Well, the next test that I would do, you see, is vitamin D level. And that's because I've learned quite a bit, and we've learned quite a bit during COVID as well, because, I mean, it's 14 months now since we started saying people, look, vitamin D is crucial for this, and vitamin C and zinc and so on, of course. But there's more and more people saying it now and paying attention to it. One of the things we've learned is that it can be really quite surprising how much variation there is in people's vitamin D levels on the same intake of vitamin D. I mean, let's just accept that we're all vitamin D deficient in this country. Certainly right here we are now, because it's any day now, if we get really sunny days, there will start to be enough UV light in the sunshine in the middle of the day to give you a little bit of vitamin D. But there hasn't been enough since September. So by this time, we're all vitamin D deficient, right? And if you've got dark skin of any sort, then you're particularly vulnerable. And that definitely was why so many people of color, health workers, were dying at the start. And a couple of doctors actually drew it to their attention. They stopped doctors dying, quite remarkably. So it's surprising. I mean, obviously, vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. And so if you have an issue with the digestion and absorption of fats, then you have an issue with the digestion and absorption of vitamin D and of all the other fat-soluble ones, vitamin K, vitamin A, vitamin B12, though that's a bit more complex. But, there's such a lot of that about. And in fact, vitamin B12 even more so, because it's such a complicated molecule. It's the most complex molecule that we have to eat.
Wow. So with so many people not being able to digest vitamin D, if they have serious gut problems, and it being so crucial and critical for so many things, including leaky gut, we now know. So what do you do with that kind of a patient?
I put them onto supplements. I mean, you can't really get enough from food, because it's only a vitamin because we don't get enough from sunlight. And we don't get enough from sunlight, firstly, because the weather here is pretty rubbish. And secondly, because we invented the electric light. And thirdly, because we then became paranoid about it and thought, oh, we're going to get skin cancer and so forth. So, quick word about skin cancer. If you're going to get a cancer, choose skin cancer. And there's good evidence that living in a tropical place where you are exposed to a lot of sunlight, or just having a lot of sunshine or high levels of vitamin D will protect you against internal cancers, but may increase your risk of getting a skin cancer. But speaking as someone who's just had a little skin cancer removed from there, I'm telling you, that's the one to have. Because you always spot it. Nobody dies of it. I'm not talking about melanoma here. That's a different story. But nobody dies of basal cell carcinomas and that kind of thing. So you have to take a supplement. And really, if you overdo it, you're not going to cause yourself any great harm. There's a complete myth going around, which has been perpetuated by NICE for several years, that anything over 4,000 or whatever is potentially toxic. Actually, they missed a naught out of that. It would be more accurate to say anything over 40,000 international units per day of vitamin D3 could cause you side effects. Reinhold Vieth, who's one of the researchers in Canada, has had a challenge out for nearly 20 years now. Anybody to show toxicity at a level of 10,000 units a day or whatever, and they haven't succeeded yet.
So how much would you tell somebody generally to take of vitamin D? And what's the best form? Is it just tablets, or should you take it as an oil, as a spray? What's the best way to take it?
I don't think it's critical so long as it's appropriately absorbed and so forth. And therefore it makes sense to take it with food, because if you're producing the digestive enzymes for protein and so forth, then you'll be digesting the oils better as well. I find that the oil-based ones are more convenient. We just drop it on the toast in the morning. But any form will do. And I would be happy to recommend 10,000 units per day to anybody in these circumstances right now. And in some cases, if they need fixing fast, then even more. There's some dramatic results that they've got in a couple of European studies giving people who have actually developed COVID illness, giving them high doses of calcifediol, which is kind of an activated form of vitamin D, and is more potent than ordinary vitamin D. But I did the maths, and what they were using was equivalent to you taking 18,000 units a day for a week.
Wow. And how long
early hospitalization, that saves lives.
Wow. So you're talking about using vitamin D for COVID and saving lives with it at about the equivalent of 18,000 IUs a day. Okay, for somebody with a gut issue, inflammatory bowel disease, or even just plain old leaky gut, what would you recommend in terms of the amounts?
I'd tweak this according to their size a bit, but I'd say 6,000 units, because 6,000 is what the San Diego studies showed was necessary to bring 95 or something % of the population up to the right level.
Now, so how quickly does that then heal the lining of the gut?
In humans, it's surprising how quickly, even though it is it's a fat soluble vitamin. And I have had people see results in 2 weeks, which is really surprising, But I think the most obvious case was, since we're talking about gut, I had a guy, a young black man with Crohn's disease. I put him on vitamin D, and he got really better in a week. And I guess that part of that story is that he was so deficient because of his skin color and having the misfortune to live in London.
Hmm. Absolutely. I mean, we have seen studies with What Doctors Don't Tell You and Get Well, that they're saying 80 to 90% of COVID cases are people with vitamin D, serious
Yeah,
vitamin D deficiencies who are, who have died from COVID.
yeah,
So, and of course, just bringing it around to COVID, although we're talking about the gut in this situation, it's fascinating to see that you made the link in your slides between heart failure and leaky gut issues, because of course all of that is tied in with COVID too. So
yeah,
vitamin D has been shown to be involved in all of the things, the systems that are at risk or that make somebody at risk
yeah.
for COVID, like
That's right.
diabetes and insulin levels and dealing with the cytokine storms, et cetera.
Yeah.
So besides vitamin D, which is a revelation really, what about, you talked about butyrates. You talked about possibly taking that aside from a ketogenic diet, as you say, high fat, low carb diet. Uh, what is it? What kind of supplements would you take to take butyrates?
Well, you can get butyrate in various forms. There used to be, well, there still are, capsules of it. The problem is that they smell like the gates of hell or whatever, you know. There's sulfurous smell to them. So you're advising people keep them in the freezer until you have to take them, and that can just suppress the smell. But there's a new form that is a liquid that has quite a pleasant sort of lemon flavor, and well, I just put a splash of that in my coffee instead of milk. There are also, you can get it intravenously.
And this is, so I want to get to intravenous in a moment. So this remind us again what butyrates do?
Well, everything the sugar doesn't really, or they counteract the effects of sugar.
And in terms of the gut, what does it? It restores the lining. It restores function.
It enables the damping down of inflammation, and it also activates the intracellular detoxing mechanisms. Right, one of the key things, these things called peroxisomes, which are tiny little short-lived bodies inside cells, but they do two things. They break down long chains of fat, rather like chopping up the firewood. They break them down into smaller particles, so we are then transported into the mitochondria to be burnt for energy. And that way they're getting rid of these potentially toxic long chain molecules. And they also break down some of the important oxidizing radicals, the oxidative stress. They do the two things together inside this little body, which protects the rest of the cell from these chemicals. Okay.
Now, how do you said there's a kind that you can now take that's not so bad. Can you talk about a particular brand, a type, or something that people can look for?
I'm a bit hesitant to at the moment, to be honest, for slightly complicated reasons that I can't really talk about. But I think, watch this space, and I think there'll be others along pretty soon.
Okay, but if people are looking for a brand now, they should look for it would be a liquid butyrate.
Yes, if possible. But I mean, if all you can get is the tablets, by all means, take the tablets. It's just a lot more efficient.
Okay.
And easier.
Okay.
Liquids.
Now let's get to phosphatidylcholine.
Okay.
So how do you give this in serious cases of inflammatory bowel disease and of course other illnesses? How do you give this? You talked about patients taking it themselves. What should they look for? But also you give this intravenously too.
Yeah.
And tell us a bit about why you do that.
Okay. There's three ways that you can give it. You can give it intravenously. You can take it by mouth, and you can do a little retention enema. There are two purposes to the phosphatidylcholine, the phospholipids. One is to nourish, to feed the cells, because these are the things that are basically make up the cell wall. And all the time, when a molecule in the wall of your cell gets oxidized, it flips out because it becomes water soluble. So it gets flipped from the inside of the membrane, which is entirely lipid, into the outside. So it's in contact with the rest of the cell and with the aqueous, the watery substance inside the cell. And there it attracts the immune system, which comes along. These cells called macrophages come along and they eat it up, just the same as they would eat up any bacteria or other things, because they have, you know, molecules that send a signal to our immune system as well. So one of the fundamental purposes of our immune system is housekeeping, is cleaning up these damaged molecules and so forth. And then they get transported off and broken down and so forth. And butyrate helps in that. And nutritionally, what you need to do then is to feed replacement molecules, so that otherwise the membrane can be kind of shriveled and unhealthy. It needs the right balance of all the omega-6s, the omega-3s, the saturated oils, and so forth. Okay, so one purpose of phosphatidylcholine, let's call it PC for convenience, please, is nutrition. It's feeding the cells, right? And of course, think about it. The cells that need lots of feeding in a hurry are the lymphocytes, the white blood cells of the immune system, because, you know, you're trying to deal with an infection or a cancer or whatever. It's a clonal expansion. You're producing, you know, hundreds, millions of these in a short space of time. So then you really need the PC to make those new cells. David Horrobin said this long ago, feed that lymphocyte, he said. So that's one purpose of it. And clearly without all that stuff, the immune system just can't function properly. And of course, the other system that needs it in a big way is the nervous system. When you think about the shape of a nerve cell, a neuron, it's got a little body there, and then it's got a long, thin axon going to wherever the synapse is, or the connection with another cell. And that axon is long and thin, and it's covered in what's called a myelin sheath, which is a multi-layer membrane, so which is lipid. So the surface to volume ratio is high. There's a lot of surface to neurons because of those axons, and most of that surface is lipid, 95% of it. So the nervous system needs a lot of lipids. That's why when you see people with psychiatric problems and so forth, the first thing you think is, this is a hungry brain, it's a starved brain. And sometimes you just pump lipids into them and you can get an immediate result. I mean, obviously sometimes things are a lot more complicated than that as well, but that's kind of your starting point, or it is for me. The other thing that the PC does is it gives us access into the cells and enables us to pull the toxins out. So we're all exposed to this stuff, you know, the gluten, the glyphosate, the nanoparticles, so on and so forth. We're all exposed to this, you know. That's why I think there was the guys in Boston, what do they call, the Environmental Working Group, who looked at babies' cord blood and found a list of 20-something different chemicals. And, you know, these babies have only just been born, and they've been exposed from their mother. So we are all exposed to these things these days. And actually, incidentally, one of the things that we're not talking about particularly today, but that we're more and more seeing as hugely important here is mold and fungi and their toxins. And
Yes, but one of our other speakers has gone into that in great detail.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're exposed to all of these chemicals, which no one else has talked about so much. So PC helps to sort of do housekeeping on these cells to pull it out. Is that right?
It enables you to get access into the cells and kind of pull the chemicals out. And we can demonstrate that this happens. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, you have to get them out of the body. And so it's fortunate that PC is also a stimulus to the liver and causes it to work more. And also use quite a bit of glutathione, which is an important molecule. It's an antioxidant. It's kind of the center of the body's antioxidant system, or the cell's antioxidant system. But it's also the main thing used by GST, which is glutathione S-transferase, which is the biggest single enzyme in phase 2 of liver hepatic detox, the process of detoxing that goes on in the liver. So a bunch of things, metals, some pesticides, petrochemicals, all sorts of things, are detoxed using that enzyme. And so glutathione is very important, and it's understandable, really, therefore, that it's what the herbalists would call a cholagogue. It stimulates the production of bile.
Right. Okay, so tell us about if people can't get intravenous PC, how much should they take? What kind should they take? What should they look for?
Okay. So
this is phosphatidylcholine.
Yes, that's right. It's you need not to be sidetracked by things like lecithin, because it's very confusing because the labeling is a complete mess. And this is primarily because of the stuff the FDA did years ago in the States. It means that you can say something is triple lecithin and it's just not good enough to have the effect that you have. In many ways, you might be better off just taking the oils sometimes. And what I would do there is, can we take a minute to talk about omega-6 and omega-3? Is that okay?
Pardon me?
Can we take a minute to talk about omega-6?
Sure, definitely. Sure, let's.
Okay. So there's a lot of people are out there saying that, what we all need is omega-3. Okay, omega-3s, so let's start at the beginning. Omega-3s are the ones that you get from fish oil, primarily, although there's also a lot in, for instance, flax oil. Omega-6s are the ones that you get from plants, and quite a lot of them, And there is a belief that's kind of built up that we're all short of omega-3s. It's not really true, and one of the reasons why it's built up is that the omega-3s are quite a small percentage of the cell membrane, and they're difficult to measure. It's difficult to measure. A laboratory has to be very, very good right down at those low levels. In fact, all the studies really show that you need omega-6 and omega-3 in roughly a ratio of 4:1. You need 4 times as much omega-6 as omega-3, both in your food and in blood test or whatever in your tissues, right? So while there are some circumstances that I do think omega-3s are appropriate, for instance, they do have a definite anti-inflammatory effect. And so I've always thought that ever since I wrote about this in Daylight Robbery, about sunlight, that it makes sense that if you're by the seaside, where you're exposed to an awful lot of UV coming from the sky and the sun and bouncing off the sea at you and so forth, it makes sense that you probably have access to an omega-3 rich diet, and that's pretty darn appropriate at the time. And you can say the same thing about, if you want to optimize your chances with vaccines like the COVID vaccine and so forth, then omega-3 will help to damp down the inflammatory reactions, as will plenty of vitamin D and vitamin C. But those are specific, that's a horse for a course. That's a particular period of time. And omega-6s are, generally speaking, more necessary. And we do see deficiencies of them because, people get to think that, well, actually, what we see more than a deficiency is you have too much omega-3 for the omega-6. The omega-6 doesn't go down, but the omega-3 goes right up. And that can be an impairment to healing, because if you think about it, inflammation is the first step in healing, right? You cut your hand, or let's say you burn your hand again in the oven. It goes red as the body opens up the vessels and makes them porous and so forth, and sends out the signal. We need these molecules, these cells here now, okay? They all pour in, the healing is done, and the process switches itself off. Mm-hmm. And omega-6s are very important. They're a critical part of that, right? If you don't have enough of the omega-6s, it gets like a stuck record or a stuck CD. It never gets to the switch off point, and therefore you end up with chronic inflammation. And broadly speaking, you say acute inflammation is good and appropriate, and so chronic inflammation is not good.
So going back to your idea that we need to take this, and presumably we need this for gut health too?
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, so there is hemp oil, which has both omega-3 and omega-6.
It's probably the best one going, really.
Okay, so taking that, having at least a tablespoon of that a day on your salads or whatever. Yeah. What about some of the...
teaspoon, don't it was.
A teaspoon?
No, it's far too little.
How much would you use?
At least a tablespoon.
Okay, so a tablespoon of hemp.
Okay. Build up to it.
1 to 3 tablespoons of hemp oil. Yeah. Now, there are also supplements that have 3, 6, and 9 in them. What are your views about that? Are they useful too?
As a general supplement, yeah. I mean, I don't think they're harmful, right? But generally speaking, I don't think I've ever seen anybody with an omega-9 deficiency. And olive oil, of course, is a very good source of omega-9s. So it's certainly not harmful, but there are circumstances in which you'd want the omega-6s to enable your healing process to happen.
Sure. So hemp oil, probably the best source.
Well, yeah, it probably is. Yeah. Yeah.
So let's go back to PC again, phosphatidylcholine. So how can we take it, and how much should we take if we've got gut problems?
Well, you could take tablespoons of it, but and you can get capsules as well. So
how much should you take?
Well, a tablespoon is going to be about 9 capsules. That's the problem. And you probably want a tablespoon a day. What I've often tended to do is say, okay, look, we'll divide this up. A tablespoon of PC and a tablespoon or 2 of the hemp oil or whatever.
Hmm.
So that kind of
Okay.
backs it up.
And so phosphatidylcholine comes as a liquid as well as tablets.
Yeah, it's quite a thick, sticky liquid.
Right. But a good thing that you can just take with food, I assume.
Yeah, that's right. And
Okay.
well, you can just take with food. But I think in all of these things, it's also worthwhile trying to take an emulsion.
And there are brands that have emulsions.
No, you make your own.
Oh, and how do you do that?
It's just a smoothie.
Ah, okay. Just put it in your smoothie. Okay.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Okay.
You put it in before you run the blender.
Right.
Because
Okay.
the thing about a smoothie is a combination of watery stuff and oily stuff that stays mixed. And it stays mixed because when you process it or blend it or use your ultrasonic machine or whatever, the oil in there spontaneously forms into little globules, nanoparticles, right? Well, if you process enough, then enough of them will be nano-sized particles, right? And so it's stable that way. That's, it's the same sort of structure as in the membranes of our cells.
Hmm.
So you process it like that, it's in tiny nanoparticles, and it stays for a reasonable while anyway in the mixture, and also it's absorbed into the cells with which it comes into contact. That's what happens with, that's what liposomal, liposomal vitamin C that you can get and so forth. That's exactly the same thing happens there. And so that's what happens when you put on a nicotine patch or a morphine patch or whatever, right? The nanoparticle is merging into the cells, into the walls of the cells with it under contact. And exactly the same thing happens inside the gut if you swallow it.
Right. So that's a great way to take it. That's a great way to take it then.
Yeah, yeah. The odds tend to make it more palatable as well. And you can put interesting stuff in the smoothie. And also, if you want to get, stuff like vitamin C or whatever in high doses, then if you put that in with the oil and everything else in the blender and process it, some of the vitamin C, the dissolved vitamin C, will end up inside the nanoparticles. So that's a
so you
delivery
created
system.
your own liposomal vitamin C.
Exactly. Yeah.
So a tablespoon of PC a day. Okay. Anything else you would say, particularly for people who have inflammatory bowel disease, the more serious stuff? Anything else? We've talked about a ketogenic diet. Are you in favor of that?
Yeah, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a complex area, and you don't know, how successful people are going to be. So we use the dual meters the diabetics can get that measure both glucose and ketones.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so what a lot of researchers would ever say is that you get the glucose down below a certain level and the ketones up above the same number, and then you've got control of your inflammation or whatever. The problem is, like so many of these things, you don't really know when you start off how easy it's going to be to achieve that. And I've talked to various people about this. For instance, there was two couples that were living together, and they were very into health. And they decided to all go on a ketogenic diet together. So they did basically exactly the same thing. For the husband of one of the couples and the lady of the other couple, it was a piece of cake. Wrong thing to say, isn't it? It was very easy. So within a few days, they were in ketosis and it didn't seem to be a problem. The other two people, it took several times as long, much harder. And of course, a lot of people now who have tried it out do say that this doesn't really work unless you get into the intermittent fasting.
Mm-hmm. And that is the fasting, that's the fasting that you leave at least 12 to 15 hours between your last meal of the day and the following morning, or you and
following lunchtime, probably, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 16 hours. And I think that's because the body recognizes two states in regards to, you know, nutritional intake. So it's either it's feast or it's fast, right? And if you're just, you know, eating the whole time and there's never an interval when there isn't stuff coming in and being processed, then it's always feast. And so the intermittent fast can be useful to get you into the you know, the ketogenic state, get you into ketosis.
And an intermittent fast is I mean, for some people, they don't cut out every kind of, you know, they're not quite as serious on the carbs. They may cut out many of the grains, but maybe they still eat buckwheat or things like that. But they use that intermittent fasting, and that gets them into ketosis.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Do you find, I mean, what's your own feeling about people doing the ketogenic diet in terms of healing their gut? Is it necessary to go that far? Is it important? Can they just stay with a paleo diet? What are your thoughts?
It's difficult to generalize, you know. I think if you're acknowledging all of these things and trying out and experimenting for yourself, you can usually figure it out, because up to a certain point, the body's got, you know, good sensors for all this stuff. And it's only when you really mess up the system that we lose our judgment on it, you know. And the most obvious way that we start to lose our system, we feed our kids loads and loads of sugar. And so they come to regard that as being, you know, the reward for everything, and as being normal. And they lose sight of, well, probably lose sight of the pleasant tastes of so many things, because a lot of the flavor of food is carried in the fatty bits.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. So generally, a low carb diet is going to be helpful for the gut.
Yeah.
And, you know, obviously avoiding sugar and things like that. Are there any other supplements that you would recommend with people with, you know, serious bowel
and so forth? Yeah. Okay. Well, I do think vitamin C, although you'd have to be, you may have to be careful. I mean, I think this is often over worried. You know, the people, oh, ascorbic acid, I don't want more acid in my stomach and so forth. No, I mean, you know as well as I do, Lynn, that an awful lot of the people who get what we tend to call acid indigestion, whatever, it's not because they've got too much acid, they've got too little acid. Mm-hmm. It can give you exactly the same symptoms.
Yes.
And it can be a good idea to take vitamin C at the start of a meal to boost your acid level and help that process of digestion. So it helps the whole process going on. Mm-hmm. And so I do think vitamin C, I do think zinc. Mm-hmm. Ideally, you'd get this stuff called zinc carnosine, which has very good record of healing the gut. But it seems to be, I don't know why, it seems to be hard to get hold of at the moment. Maybe it's a COVID effect. They're all busy making stuff for COVID. I don't know. The other thing that I would say, which is not actually a supplement, is vagal stimulation.
And how do you do that? And you're talking about the vagus nerve, the nerve that starts around the neck and winds its way through all of the major organs of the body. And of course, people call that the love nerve because it's involved in the release of oxytocin and all that sorts of things. And it seems to get stimulated with things like compassion. So tell us why that's important for the gut. Okay. And how you do it.
All right. So let's put it in context, so it's part of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic has two halves. There's the sympathetic, which runs on adrenaline and is to do with fight and flight and alertness and so forth, right? And there's the parasympathetic, which is to do with rest and repair and digest, right? And the vagus nerve is a major part of that. And it serves all the internal organs from the mouth and the nose right down to the anus. And so obviously the digestion is dependent on it. And one of the things that happens is that there are more signals going from the organs to the brain than coming from the brain to the organs. There's, 2 or 3 times as much. And if one organ is sending alarm signals to the brain, then it can mess up the functioning of all the other organs. And because, because of stress, really, it's very easy to have an imbalance where you've got too much adrenaline, too much worry and so forth going on, so too much fight or flight. And that, obviously, that shuts down the digestion, for instance, whereas the vagus is useful to open it. Now, normally one of the key ways to get into this has always been breathing, because it's the only one of these rhythms of the body that you can actively control. So that's, the breathing there is sort of, 1/3 in, 1/3 out, 1/3 hold on the out. That kind of thing is pretty much the same breathing as you do in yoga or meditation or chanting or prayer or indeed communal singing. Well, they're all pretty much the same thing. And though, of course, if you do it in a group, then you're all helping each other.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole effect is enhanced.
Yes.
But sometimes it's not enough, and so I'm going to plug one thing here, okay, which is this thing called a sensate, made by my friend Stefan. And well, this comes Stefan Schmelik.
And it's called what again?
It's called a sensate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Basically, it vibrates and it links to an app on your phone. And so you put your headphones in, and there's a track that runs here that is from the phone into your ears that is sending, it's what they call a binaural signal. So there's a subtle difference between the left and the right side. And that sends a rhythm that you don't perceive consciously, but it entrains your brain waves, it affects your brain that way. And this thing just sits there, you loop it around your neck, and it sits there, and it vibrates in synchrony with the app on your phone. And through the breastbone there, it sends a signal up the vagus nerve. And I've had patients who said, "Oh, this thing changed my life in 5 days." I don't guarantee that that's going to do everything, but I have to tell you, these days, I mean, I think we're all under a particular form of stress, and I've found it very useful myself. To get rid of that sense of dread or impending doom. So use this, and I know that I still know that we're all done for probably, but I don't feel so bad about it.
That's so great. And in this time of COVID, where a lot of people have been feeling so stressed, and that's been affecting their guts, etc., that's a great thing. So Sensate, can we just find it on the internet, or is it a particular URL people should look up?
Getsensate.com.
Get GETSENSATE
.com,
dot
correct.
com.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, Damien, that was just fantastic.